There are certain cases in the long career of my friend Sherlock Holmes which, even after many years, remain vivid in my memory with a clarity that no passage of time can diminish. Some were remarkable for the brutality of the crime, others for the ingenuity of the criminal mind behind them. Yet among all the mysteries I had the privilege to witness, none unsettled me more deeply than the strange and dangerous affair which I have titled the 2-to-1 bee trap. It was a case that not only threatened lives, but challenged Holmes himself in a manner I had never before seen. For it was the one occasion upon which my brilliant companion faced an adversary who seemed capable of anticipating his every move. The events began upon a bleak winter morning in London, when the fog lay so thick upon Baker Street that the lamps outside our windows glowed like dim moons suspended in gray smoke. Holmes and I had just finished breakfast in the familiar sitting room of 221B. The fire burned brightly in the grate, and Holmes, clad in his dressing gown, lounged in the armchair with the languid air of a man suffering from a temporary absence of intellectual stimulation. His long fingers toyed idly with a violin bow while he stared into the fire with half-closed eyes. "London has become dreadfully dull, Watson," he remarked suddenly. "One might imagine that every criminal in the city has taken a holiday." I laughed quietly as I folded the morning newspaper. Surely that would be a blessing rather than a disappointment. Holmes gave a faint smile. To the average citizen, perhaps. But to a consulting detective, crime is merely the raw material of thought. Without it, the mind stagnates. Before I could reply, the door below slammed with unusual force. A moment later, we heard hurried footsteps upon the staircase, followed by an urgent knock. Mrs. Hudson entered the room with an expression that I can only describe as alarmed curiosity. "There's a gentleman downstairs asking for Mr. Holmes," she said. "But he's in a dreadful state, sir. I've never seen anyone look so frightened." Holmes rose instantly, his lethargy vanishing like mist before the sun. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." Within seconds, the visitor entered our room. He was a young man of perhaps 30, pale and visibly shaken, with dark hair that had been hastily brushed and a coat still dusted with the damp of the London fog. His eyes moved nervously around the room until they settled upon Holmes. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I am he." "Pray sit down and compose yourself." The man sank into the nearest chair, but seemed incapable of stillness. His hands trembled, and I noticed that his collar was askew, as though he had dressed in great haste. "My name is Arthur Bellingham," he said breathlessly, "and I believe there has been a murder." Holmes remained perfectly calm. "Where did this occur?" The young man swallowed. "Here." Holmes raised one eyebrow. "Here." "In Baker Street," Bellingham clarified. Holmes gestured calmly toward the window. "Then perhaps you should summon the police." Bellingham shook his head violently. "You don't understand. The body was found only a few minutes ago." "And where precisely was it found?" The man looked directly at Holmes. "In your house." The silence that followed was so complete that even the crackling of the fire seemed suddenly loud. Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw his eyes sharpen with sudden interest. "You claim that a body has been discovered inside 221B Baker Street?" "Yes." Holmes turned slowly toward me. "My dear Watson," he said quietly, "it appears that London has decided to relieve my boredom after all." Within moments, we descended the stairs behind our agitated visitor. A small crowd had gathered in the narrow hallway below, including Mrs. Hudson and two bewildered constables who had arrived from the street. The air was thick with confusion and whispered speculation. The body lay near the foot of the staircase. I pushed gently through the onlookers and knelt beside the fallen man. Even before examining him closely, I knew that life had left him. His face was pale, and a small dark stain had spread across his waistcoat. "He's been stabbed," I said gravely. Holmes crouched beside me, studying the scene with that extraordinary concentration which had solved so many mysteries before. "What is most remarkable," he murmured softly, "is not the wound? What then?" I asked. Holmes pointed toward the victim's hand. Clutched tightly between the man's fingers was a small, folded piece of paper. Holmes carefully removed it and opened the note. For the briefest moment, a look of genuine surprise crossed his usually composed face. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me the paper. Upon it were written just 6 words. "I warned you about the trap." Below the message was a name, not the victim's name, but Holmes. I looked up in confusion. Holmes was staring down at the body with an expression I had never before seen upon his face. It was not fear nor anger. It was recognition and Then he spoke the words that chilled me more than the sight of the murder itself. "My dear Watson," he said quietly, "I believe this man died trying to reach me." He rose slowly and glanced around the narrow hallway of Baker Street, as though searching the shadows for an unseen observer. "For the first time in many years," he continued, "someone has arranged a crime not merely to challenge me, but to trap me. And as I looked down once more at the dead man lying within the very house we called home, I realized with growing unease that the true mystery had only just begun. For whoever had planned this murder had done something extraordinary. They had brought the crime directly to 221B Baker Street, and in doing so, they had turned Holmes himself into part of the puzzle. The discovery of a murdered man within the very walls of Baker Street created a sensation unlike any I had previously witnessed in my years beside Sherlock Holmes. Though Holmes had been consulted in countless baffling crimes throughout London, the notion that a body could appear inside our own residence was both extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The narrow hallway of 221B quickly filled with murmuring voices as curious neighbors, 2 uniformed constables, and our visibly distressed landlady gathered near the base of the staircase where the unfortunate victim lay. Holmes, however, displayed none of the agitation that had overtaken the others. Instead, he knelt beside the body with the calm attentiveness of a scholar examining a rare specimen, his sharp gray eyes moving from one small detail to another, with such deliberate precision that I could already tell his mind had begun assembling a chain of reasoning far beyond the understanding of those around him. The victim, as I had already observed, was a middle-aged gentleman of respectable appearance, dressed in a dark coat and waistcoat that bore the unmistakable signs of a recent struggle. The wound which had taken his life appeared to be a single thrust from a narrow blade, delivered with sufficient accuracy to pierce the heart. Yet Holmes seemed far less interested in the wound itself than in the peculiar circumstances surrounding the man's presence within Baker Street. He examined the soles of the victim's shoes, the creases of his coat, and the position in which the body had fallen, occasionally murmuring faint observations that none of the constables appeared to understand. I watched him closely, attempting to follow his reasoning. But as was often the case in the early stages of one of his investigations, the significance of the clues remained entirely obscure to me after several minutes of careful inspection. Holmes rose slowly to his feet and turned toward the anxious young man who had brought news of the tragedy, Mr. Arthur Bellingham. The fellow stood near the wall with a pale and unsettled expression, wringing his hands as though the mere presence of the corpse filled him with dread. Holmes studied him with quiet interest before speaking in a tone that was both calm and curiously penetrating. "You stated earlier, Mr. Bellingham, that you discovered this unfortunate gentleman only moments ago," Holmes began. "May I ask under what circumstances you came to be here this morning?" Bellingham swallowed nervously before replying. He explained that he had arrived at Baker Street with the intention of consulting Holmes regarding what he described as a matter of considerable personal danger. According to his account, He had scarcely reached the entrance of the house when he noticed the body lying at the foot of the stairs. Whereupon he had immediately sought assistance from those nearby. His explanation seemed plausible enough on the surface. Yet I could see from the faint narrowing of Holmes' eyes that something within the young man's story had already captured his suspicion. Holmes did not challenge him immediately. Instead, he began asking several seemingly unrelated questions concerning Bellingham's journey to Baker Street that morning, what route he had taken, at what hour he had left his home, and whether he had encountered anyone unusual along the way. The young man answered with visible unease, occasionally glancing toward the lifeless figure on the floor as though expecting it to move. It was at this moment that Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived upon the scene, accompanied by another officer who began clearing the gathering crowd from the hallway. Lestrade greeted Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and professional irritation, which was quite typical of the inspector whenever he encountered a mystery already under Holmes' scrutiny. After a brief examination of the body, he turned toward Holmes with a skeptical expression. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said dryly, "this is certainly an unusual place to find a murder victim. Care to explain how a dead man ended up inside your own house?" Holmes gave a faint smile at this remark, though his eyes retained their thoughtful intensity. He explained that he had been upstairs in the sitting room with me at the time the body was discovered, and had only learned of the matter when Mr. Bellingham arrived seeking assistance. Lestrade appeared satisfied with this explanation, though. He made a brief note in his notebook before ordering the constables to begin examining the surrounding area for witnesses. While the inspector busied himself with official procedures, Holmes turned once more toward the dead man's hand, from which he had earlier removed the small folded note. The message I warned you about the trap remained one of the most perplexing aspects of the affair. The fact that the note contained Holmes' name suggested that the victim had come specifically to warn him of some impending danger. Yet the unfortunate man had died before he could deliver whatever message he had intended to convey. Holmes studied the handwriting carefully before slipping the paper into his pocket. He then walked slowly toward the doorway of the house and examined the street beyond, where the fog still lingered in pale swirls beneath the gas lamps. When he returned to the hallway, his expression had taken on that familiar look of quiet satisfaction which signaled the discovery of some small but significant clue. "My dear Watson," he said calmly, "I believe our visitor was telling the truth about one thing." "And what is that?" I asked. Holmes glanced briefly toward Arthur Bellingham, who still appeared deeply unsettled by the entire affair. "That this matter concerns a trap." I looked at him in confusion, but Holmes merely continued speaking in his measured, analytical tone. The position of the body, the direction of the wound, and the curious timing of Mr. Bellingham's arrival all suggest that this unfortunate gentleman was not attacked in the street as one might initially suppose. On the contrary, the evidence strongly indicates that he entered the house voluntarily and encountered his assailant here. Lestrade looked up sharply at this remark. "Inside the house?" he repeated. Holmes nodded calmly. "Double quotes, yes. And if my reasoning is correct, Inspector, then the man who killed him intended something far more elaborate than a simple murder." Lestrade frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes' gaze drifted toward the staircase leading up to our sitting room. "It means," he said quietly, "that this crime was arranged for a very specific purpose." "And what purpose is that, Octroi?" I asked. Holmes' expression grew unusually serious. "To draw me into the game." The words hung in the air with a quiet menace that none of us could ignore. For if Holmes was correct, then the murderer had not only chosen Baker Street as the scene of the crime, but had done so deliberately to attract Holmes' attention. In other words, the trap mentioned in the note had already been sprung, and my brilliant friend, whether he wished it or not, was now standing at its very center. The confusion which had filled the narrow hallway of Baker Street gradually subsided. As the officers from Scotland Yard carried the body of the unfortunate victim into a waiting carriage to be transported for official examination. Yet despite the activity surrounding us, my attention remained fixed upon the thoughtful figure of Sherlock Holmes, who stood near the doorway with his long coat draped loosely about his shoulders and his keen gray eyes studying every detail of the house's entrance, as though the walls themselves might betray some hidden secret. Holmes possessed the rare ability to observe even the smallest irregularities with extraordinary precision. And I could tell from the quiet intensity of his expression that the peculiar circumstances of this crime had already awakened his full intellectual curiosity. Once the body had been removed and the curious neighbors dispersed, Holmes requested permission from Inspector Lestrade to conduct a more thorough examination of the immediate surroundings. The inspector, though often reluctant to admit Holmes' superiority in matters of deduction, recognized that the consulting detective's assistance could prove invaluable in a mystery as unusual as this one. With a reluctant nod, he allowed Holmes free access to the hallway and staircase, provided that no evidence was disturbed without the presence of an officer. Holmes began his investigation with the patience of a man assembling a complex puzzle. He first examined the wooden floorboards where the victim had fallen, kneeling down to inspect the faint impressions left by shoes upon the damp surface. The fog of the morning had carried a slight moisture into the house, and Holmes believed this small detail might reveal whether more than one person had been present at the time of the struggle. With a small magnifying lens drawn from his pocket, he traced the outlines of several footprints, measuring their length and depth with meticulous care. I watched him silently, attempting to discern the significance of his observations, but, as was so often the case in the early stages of his investigations, the conclusions toward which his mind moved remained entirely invisible to me. After several minutes of quiet analysis, Holmes rose and turned his attention toward the staircase that led to our sitting room above. He ascended slowly, pausing occasionally to inspect the banister or the worn carpet along the steps. At one point he knelt again to examine a faint smear upon the edge of the stair, touching it lightly with his finger before holding it toward the light that filtered through the hallway window. His eyes narrowed for a moment in contemplation, though he offered no explanation for the discovery. Meanwhile, Inspector Lestrade questioned Arthur Bellingham in the front room regarding the events that had brought him to Baker Street that morning. From where I stood, I could hear portions of their conversation, and it was evident that the young man's story remained consistent with what he had previously told us. He claimed to have arrived at the house only moments before discovering the body and insisted that he had no knowledge of the victim's identity or the circumstances surrounding the attack. Yet, despite the apparent sincerity of his statements, I could not help noticing the persistent nervousness with which he answered the inspector's inquiries. Holmes soon returned from his inspection of the staircase and moved quietly toward the small table near the entrance where the victim's belongings had been placed. Among them were a watch, a leather wallet, and a small notebook containing several pages of handwritten notes. Holmes examined each item carefully, his long fingers moving with deliberate gentleness so as not to disturb any potential evidence. When he opened the notebook, however, his expression changed ever so slightly. "What have you found?" I asked. Holmes turned one of the pages toward me. Inside the notebook were several short entries written in hurried script, each consisting of little more than a name or address followed by a date. At first glance they appeared entirely ordinary, yet Holmes pointed out that many of the entries had been crossed out with thick lines of ink, as though the writer had intentionally marked them as completed tasks. "What do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes closed the notebook thoughtfully. "It appears that our unfortunate visitor had been conducting an investigation of his own," he replied quietly. "And judging from the pattern of these entries, I suspect he was attempting to track the movements of a particular individual." "Do you know who?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Not yet, Watson, but I believe the answer may lie within the final page." He opened the notebook once more and turned to the back, where a single name had been written in bold, deliberate letters. The name had not been crossed out. Instead, beneath it were two words that caused Holmes' expression to grow suddenly serious. Baker Street. Holmes closed the notebook slowly and slipped it into his pocket. "My dear Watson," he said, in a tone of quiet certainty, "it would appear that the victim came here with a very specific purpose in mind." "To meet you?" I suggested. Holmes nodded faintly. "That seems the most logical conclusion." At that moment, Inspector Lestrade approached us with a thoughtful frown upon his face. "We've identified the dead man," he said. "His name is Edward Mallory, a clerk employed by a private shipping firm near the docks. Nothing remarkable about him as far as we can tell." Holmes listened carefully before replying. "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe Mr. Mallory may prove to be quite remarkable indeed." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" Holmes glanced briefly toward the staircase leading to our sitting room before answering. "Because he appears to have died while attempting to warn me of a danger." "What sort of danger?" Lestrade asked. Holmes' gaze returned to the folded note bearing his name. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what we must discover." He stepped toward the doorway once more and looked out into the fog-covered street where London continued its restless morning routine. Yet I sensed that Holmes' mind had already begun moving several steps ahead of us all, piecing together fragments of evidence that none of us had yet fully understood. For somewhere within the details of Edward Mallory's final journey lay the first true clue to a mystery that had been deliberately constructed around 221B Baker Street itself. And if Holmes' instincts were correct, then the unseen architect of this crime had planned it with extraordinary care. Care enough, perhaps, to challenge even the unmatched intellect of Sherlock Holmes. The strange affair, which had begun with the discovery of a murdered man within our own residence, soon spread through London with remarkable speed. By the afternoon, the newspapers had already begun whispering about the extraordinary circumstance that a crime connected to Sherlock Holmes had taken place inside Baker Street itself. Holmes, however, appeared utterly indifferent to the public attention. Once the official procedures of Scotland Yard had concluded and the body of the unfortunate Edward Mallory had been removed, he returned upstairs to our sitting room with the quiet determination of a man whose mind had already begun assembling the scattered pieces of a complex puzzle. I observed him carefully as he moved about the room, placing Mallory's notebook, the mysterious warning note, and several other small observations upon the table before the fireplace. Holmes possessed a curious habit during difficult investigations. He would pace slowly across the room, pausing now and then to examine a clue before continuing his restless circuit, as though each movement helped align the invisible threads of deduction forming within his mind. The afternoon light filtered dimly through the fogged windows of Baker Street, and the room had taken on that subdued atmosphere which often accompanied the early stages of Holmes' most perplexing cases. For my own part, I found the entire situation deeply troubling. That a man had been murdered within the very entrance of our home suggested a level of boldness or, perhaps, calculation on the part of the killer that was most unusual. As I watched Holmes examining the contents of Mallory's notebook once again, I could not help but voice the question that had been troubling me since morning. "Holmes," I said, "do you truly believe the crime was meant to draw you personally into the affair?" Holmes looked up from the notebook and regarded me with that faintly amused expression which so often accompanied my attempts to follow his reasoning. "My dear Watson," he replied calmly, "it would be difficult to reach any other conclusion. Consider the evidence before us. A man travels across London carrying a written warning addressed to me. He arrives at Baker Street in obvious haste, only to be stabbed within the entrance of the very house where I reside. The probability that these events are coincidental is so remote that we may safely dismiss it altogether." I was about to reply when there came a firm knock upon the door. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson entered, announcing that Inspector Lestrade had returned with new developments in the case. The inspector stepped into the room with his usual brisk manner, removing his hat as he approached the table where Holmes stood. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I believe we may have made some progress." Holmes raised an eyebrow with polite interest. "Indeed, Inspector." Lestrade produced a small document from his coat pocket and laid it upon the table. "Our inquiries into the victim's background have uncovered something rather curious. It appears that Edward Mallory had recently filed a complaint with his employer concerning irregularities in their shipping accounts. According to several witnesses at the firm, he believed someone within the company was involved in fraudulent dealings." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "And did he name the individual responsible?" Lestrade nodded, double quotes, "Yes, a man named Charles Davenport." The name seemed to carry weight even before the inspector explained further. Davenport, according to Lestrade, was a senior manager within the shipping firm where Mallory worked, a man of considerable influence and wealth, who had been with the company for many years. Several employees had reported heated arguments between Mallory and Davenport during the previous week, particularly after Mallory had threatened to expose what he believed to be falsified financial records. "To make matters worse for Mr. Davenport," Lestrade continued, "we've discovered that he left his office shortly before Mallory was killed and cannot account for his whereabouts during the hour in which the murder likely occurred." I glanced toward Holmes, expecting to see the spark of interest that usually accompanied the emergence of a promising suspect. Instead, Holmes' expression remained curiously thoughtful. "Have you questioned Mr. Davenport?" he asked. Lestrade shook his head. "Not yet. But we intend to bring him in for questioning this evening. Between the quarrel, the financial motive, and the missing hour in his schedule, the case against him looks rather strong." Holmes remained silent for several seconds, his fingers lightly touching the edge of Mallory's notebook. "There is one additional matter," Lestrade added. "We also found a letter among Mallory's belongings that appears to confirm the dispute." He handed the document to Holmes. The letter was written in an agitated tone and appeared to be part of an ongoing exchange between Mallory and Davenport regarding the alleged financial irregularities. The final lines were particularly striking, as Davenport had written a clear warning that Mallory should abandon his accusations before he regretted interfering in matters beyond his understanding. Lestrade folded his arms with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of that? Looks rather like motive, wouldn't you say?" Holmes read the letter once more before placing it carefully upon the table. For a brief moment he said nothing, and I could see that his mind was weighing the evidence with great precision. "Yes," he said slowly, "it certainly appears convincing." Lestrade allowed himself a small smile. "I thought you might say that. With a bit of luck, we may have this whole business wrapped up before the week is out." Holmes turned toward the window, gazing out into the dim London street where the fog continued to drift between the gas lamps. "It is indeed possible," he said, quietly, yet there was something in his voice that suggested hesitation after Lestrade departed to continue his investigation. I turned to Holmes with curiosity. "You do not seem entirely convinced," I observed. Holmes gave a faint smile. "My dear Watson, experience has taught me that when a solution appears too quickly in a complex matter, it is usually because someone wishes us to accept it without further examination. You believe Davenport may be innocent?" Holmes shook his head slightly. "I do not yet know whether he is innocent or guilty. What troubles me is the elegance of the evidence. The argument, the threatening letter, the missing hour, all of it forms a remarkably convenient narrative. And you distrust convenient narratives," I said. Holmes' eyes glimmered with quiet intensity. "Precisely." He returned to the table and picked up the small note that had been found in Mallory's hand. I warned you about the trap, Holmes. Studied the message once again before slipping it into his pocket. My dear Watson, he continued thoughtfully, if our mysterious adversary truly wished to construct a trap for me, then presenting an obvious suspect would be a most effective first move. I looked at him with growing unease. You mean Davenport may simply be a distraction? Holmes nodded slowly. It is a possibility we must consider. He turned once more toward the foggy window of Baker Street, his expression thoughtful yet determined. For if this case has been arranged with the care I suspect, then the true architect of Edward Mallory's death has not only anticipated the investigation of Scotland Yard, but has also anticipated mine. And in that quiet moment, I began to understand that the mystery surrounding the murder at Baker Street was far more intricate than any of us had yet imagined, for the game, as Holmes himself often said, had only just begun. That evening settled upon London with a heavy stillness, the fog outside Baker Street thickening into a gray veil that muffled the sounds of passing carriages and distant footsteps. Within the sitting room of 2-1B, the atmosphere was no less dense. For the strange and troubling circumstances surrounding the death of Edward Mallory had begun to weigh heavily upon my thoughts. Yet the mind of Sherlock Holmes appeared more alert than ever, and the peculiar brightness in his eyes suggested that the puzzle had already begun to yield its first genuine threads of logic. Holmes had spent the better part of the afternoon reviewing every detail connected to the case. Mallory's notebook lay open upon the small table beside his chair, while the warning note discovered in the dead man's hand rested beneath a magnifying lens. From time to time, Holmes would rise and pace slowly across the room before returning to examine one of the documents again, as though confirming some minute observation that had occurred to him moments before. I had seen him behave in precisely this manner during many difficult investigations, and I knew from experience that such restlessness indicated the formation of a critical deduction. For my own part, I attempted to follow the trail of reasoning he pursued, though I confess the evidence remained stubbornly obscure. The suspicion directed toward Charles Davenport appeared convincing enough on the surface. The quarrel between Davenport and Mallory, the threatening letter discovered among the victim's papers, and the unexplained absence during the hour of the murder formed a sequence of facts that would have satisfied most investigators. Yet Holmes' persistent skepticism had begun to plant seeds of doubt even within my own mind. At length, I could restrain my curiosity no longer. "Holmes," I said, setting aside the newspaper I had been pretending to read, "you have been studying that note for nearly an hour. Surely there must be something about it that troubles you." Holmes did not look up immediately. Instead, he adjusted the magnifying lens slightly and studied the paper for several seconds longer before replying. "My dear Watson, there are few things in this world more revealing than a written message composed under conditions of urgency, because the writer has no time to disguise his intentions." I suggested, "Precisely. And in such moments, even the smallest detail may betray the truth." He lifted the note carefully and held it toward the lamp so that the light passed through the thin paper. "You will recall that the message reads, 'I warned you about the trap.' A curious phrase, is it not? It suggests that the victim had previously attempted to contact you," I said. Holmes nodded slightly. That was my first impression as well. Yet the phrasing contains an interesting implication. The writer claims to have issued a warning before the moment of his death. I considered this for a moment. "You mean he had already warned you once before?" "Exactly." Holmes placed the paper back upon the table. "And yet, Watson, I have no recollection whatsoever of receiving such a warning." This statement struck me as rather puzzling. "Perhaps the message was intended metaphorically," I suggested. "The man may have been referring to a warning he intended to give you when he arrived at Baker Street." Holmes shook his head. Slowly, "No. The wording suggests a previous communications, something already delivered. The victim believed that I had been warned earlier and had failed to heed the warning. I leaned forward with growing interest. Then someone must have sent you a message before this morning, Holmes? Expression remained thoughtful. That is precisely the inconsistency which troubles me. He rose and walked toward the mantelpiece where several unopened letters from the morning's post had been placed. Holmes sifted through them briefly before selecting a single envelope which he had apparently set aside earlier without comment. This letter arrived shortly before the incident, he said. Quietly, I watched as he opened it once again and spread its contents upon the table. The letter itself appeared entirely ordinary. It contained a brief request from a gentleman claiming to possess information regarding a matter of criminal importance and asking Holmes to meet him later in the week. There was nothing in its wording that seemed remarkably till Holmes pointed toward the signature at the bottom. Edward Mallory. I read aloud. Holmes nodded. Double quotes, yes. The very same man who was murdered in our hallway. Stared at the letter in surprise. Then he did attempt to contact you before his death. Holmes folded his arms. Thoughtfully, indeed he did. But that is not the inconsistency which interests me. He turned the envelope over in his hand and tapped it gently upon the table. Observe the postmark. I examined it carefully. It was mailed yesterday evening. I said. Precisely. Holmes' eyes gleamed with quiet intensity, which raises a most intriguing question. What question? I asked. Holmes leaned slightly closer to the table. If Mallory believed he had already warned me about the trap, why would he send a letter requesting a meeting several days later? I considered the matter carefully, but could find no satisfactory answer. Perhaps he changed his mind, I suggested. Holmes shook his head once again. No, Watson. A man who fears for his life does not arrange casual appointments. He returned to his chair and steepled his long fingers before him. There is only one explanation which satisfies the evidence. And what is that? Holmes spoke with quiet certainty. The letter was not written yesterday evening. I stared at him in astonishment. But the postmark can be falsified, Holmes interrupted calmly, particularly by someone with access to the appropriate facilities. A silence fell between us as the implications of his words began to take shape. You believe someone forged the letter? I asked slowly. Holmes nodded. Someone who wished to create the impression that Edward Mallory had intended to visit me under ordinary circumstances. Why would they do that? Holmes' expression grew unusually serious. To conceal the true purpose of his visit, he lifted the small warning note once more. The unfortunate man came to Baker Street not to arrange a consultation, but to deliver a warning. And someone ensured he never had the chance, I said quietly. Holmes rose and walked toward the window, gazing into the fog-covered street below. Double quotes, yes. Watson, he replied, for somewhere in London there is a mind capable of anticipating each step of this investigation. He turned back toward me with a faint, almost admiring smile. And that mind has already begun arranging the next move. At that moment, a sudden and unsettling thought crossed my mind. Holmes, I said slowly, if this adversary is capable of planning events so carefully, do you believe he anticipated that you would discover the forgery? Holmes' eyes gleamed with a curious mixture of excitement and caution. My dear Watson, he replied softly, I suspect he is counting on it. And with that cryptic remark, Holmes returned his attention to the evidence before him, leaving me with the uneasy realization that the hidden architect of the Baker Street trap might be far more formidable than any criminal we had previously encountered. The following morning broke over London with a cold gray light that seemed to press heavily upon the fog-shrouded streets. I rose earlier than usual that day, troubled by the perplexing developments of the previous evening, and by the curious intensity with which Sherlock Holmes had examined the evidence. Holmes himself had remained awake long after midnight, seated in his armchair with the forged letter from Edward Mallory and the cryptic warning note spread before him upon the table. When at last I retired to my room, I could still hear the soft scratch of his pen as he made careful annotations upon a sheet of paper, recording observations that he did not yet share with me. When I returned to the sitting room the next morning, I found Holmes already dressed and standing near the window, gazing down at Baker Street with a level of focus that suggested his mind had been working steadily throughout the night. His breakfast remained untouched beside him, and the familiar violin rested upon the chair as though he had briefly considered playing it, but had been too absorbed in thought to follow through with the impulse. "You have not slept." I observed Holmes turn slightly and gave a faint smile. "Sleep, my dear Watson, is a luxury that the mind cannot always afford when confronted with an adversary of uncommon foresight." "Adversary," I repeated. "You speak as though you have already identified the man responsible for Mallory's death." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Not identified, Watson, but I have begun to perceive the outline of the mind behind it." Before I could question him further, a sudden and urgent knock sounded upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, visibly agitated, announcing that Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard had arrived with news of great importance. The inspector himself followed close behind, his usually composed demeanor replaced by an expression of unmistakable alarm. "Mr. Holmes," he said without preamble, "I'm afraid the situation has grown considerably worse." Holmes regarded him calmly. "Another development, Inspector." Lestrade removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair in visible frustration. "There has been another attack." The words seemed to settle heavily within the room. "Where?" Holmes asked. "At the offices of the Davenport Shipping Company." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "Charles Davenport." Lestrade nodded. Double quotes, yes, or rather, an attempt on his life. This revelation struck me with considerable surprise. Only the previous day Davenport had appeared to be the most likely suspect in the murder of Edward Mallory. Now he himself had become the target of violence. "What happened?" I asked. Lestrade explained that Davenport had been discovered early that morning in his private office, unconscious and suffering from the effects of what appeared to be a powerful sedative. The windows of the office had been forced open from the outside, and several papers from Davenport's desk had been stolen. Most alarming of all, a message had been left upon the wall above the desk, written hastily in dark ink. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What message?" Lestrade reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet, containing a rough sketch of the writing. Holmes studied it carefully before handing it to me. The message contained only a few words: "The trap closes." Cold sensation ran through me as I read the phrase. Holmes remained silent for several seconds, though I noticed that his fingers had tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. "Davenport survived?" he asked. "Yes," Lestrade replied. "Barely conscious when we found him, but alive. The doctor says he'll recover." Holmes nodded slowly, as though confirming some internal calculation. "And the stolen papers?" he asked. Lestrade sighed. "That's the curious part." According to Davenport's secretary, the documents concerned financial transfers connected to several shipping accounts, precisely the same records that Edward Mallory had been investigating before his death. Holmes turned toward the window once more, his gaze thoughtful and distant. "So our adversary has removed the evidence that might have exposed his operations," he murmured. Lestrade frowned. "You still believe Davenport isn't the murderer?" Holmes turned back toward him with quiet certainty. "I believe Davenport has now become a second victim." The inspector appeared unconvinced. "But the argument with Mallory?" The threatening letter, Holmes raised a hand gently, were all part of the illusion. Lestrade looked perplexed. Then who benefits from framing Davenport? Holmes remained silent for a moment before answering. Someone who wished to remove two obstacles at once. I felt a growing unease as the pieces of the puzzle began to form a more troubling pattern. Mallory was investigating the financial accounts, I said slowly, and Davenport had access to them. Holmes nodded, double quotes, yes, which means the true criminal required only one additional step to secure his position. And that step was, I prompted. Holmes' voice grew quieter, to ensure that both men could no longer reveal what they had discovered. Lestrade stared at him in astonishment. You mean Mallory and Davenport were both targets? Precisely. The inspector paced the room in agitation. Then the fellow who did this must be extraordinarily careful. Not a single witness saw him enter the office, and the building was locked overnight. Holmes' eyes gleamed faintly, which means he possessed the means to enter without attracting suspicion. A silence followed as the implications settled upon us all. At length, Holmes spoke again, though this time there was a peculiar intensity in his voice. "My dear Watson," he said quietly, "you will recall that the first message warned me about a trap." "Yes," I replied. Holmes gestured toward the second message, now lying upon the table, and this message informs us that the trap is closing. I looked at him with growing apprehension. You believe the two events are connected? Holmes nodded. Undoubtedly. He paused for a moment before adding in a tone that sent a chill through me. And if that is the case, Watson, then the person responsible for these crimes has not yet completed his design. Lestrade folded his arms impatiently. What design? Holmes' gaze moved slowly around the familiar room of Baker Street, the one he began when he placed a dead man at the foot of our staircase. I followed his gaze toward the door, suddenly aware of the unsettling possibility that our mysterious adversary had been observing us far more closely than we had imagined. For the trap, it seemed, had not been intended merely for Edward Mallory, nor even for Charles Davenport. The true objective, as Holmes himself had begun to suspect, might be something far more dangerous. It might be Sherlock Holmes himself. The revelation that Charles Davenport had narrowly escaped an attempt upon his life altered the entire complexion of the case. And from that moment onward, I noticed a subtle yet unmistakable change in the demeanor of Sherlock Holmes. Though Holmes had always approached crime with intellectual curiosity rather than emotion, there was now a deeper intensity to his manner, as though he had finally recognized the scope of the mind that opposed him. For the first time since I had known him, Holmes seemed to acknowledge that the architect of this strange affair possessed a strategic intelligence not unlike his own. After Inspector Lestrade departed to oversee the recovery of Charles Davenport and to continue the inquiries of Scotland Yard, Holmes remained silent for a considerable time, standing beside the fireplace with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. I had learned over the years that such silence was rarely idle. Rather, it marked the moment when Holmes assembled the scattered threads of evidence into a coherent structure of reasoning. Yet on this occasion there was something else in his expression, an almost reluctant admiration for the opponent who had constructed so elaborate a puzzle. You appear impressed, I ventured at last. Holmes turned his gaze toward me with a faint smile. My dear Watson, one must always respect a capable adversary. The man who has engineered these events has demonstrated foresight, patience, and a remarkable understanding of human behavior. He anticipated that Mallory would attempt to warn me, arranged circumstances that led to the man's death at my doorstep, and then placed suspicion upon Davenport while simultaneously eliminating the evidence that might have exposed his own involvement. It is a sequence of actions that reveals not merely criminal ambition, but strategic brilliance. You speak as though he had been studying you. I said. Holmes nodded slowly. That possibility grows more likely with each new development. The thought unsettled me greatly. Holmes had faced many dangerous criminals in the past, but rarely had any demonstrated the capacity to plan events with such precision. If our adversary truly understood Holmes' methods, then the contest between them promised to be unlike any investigation I had witnessed. Holmes crossed the room and retrieved Mallory's notebook from the table. The key to this matter lies not in what we have seen, he continued thoughtfully, but in what has been deliberately concealed. He opened the notebook once again and examined. The final entries where several names and addresses had been listed before being crossed out. You'll recall that Mallory had been investigating irregularities within the Davenport Shipping Company, Holmes said. Yet these entries suggest he was also tracing the movements of someone else, a person whose identity he had not yet confirmed. And you believe that person is our murderer? Holmes closed the notebook gently. I believe that person is the one who feared Mallory's investigation. He paced slowly across the room, the quiet rhythm of his footsteps reflecting the careful progression of his thoughts. Our opponent has thus far maintained the advantage by controlling the circumstances of each event. He decides when and where the crimes occur, while we are left merely to examine the aftermath. Such an arrangement is unacceptable. You intend to change the rules of the game? I asked. Holmes' eyes gleamed with quiet determination. Precisely. He turned toward the writing desk and began composing a short note upon a sheet of paper. What are you doing? I asked, setting a trap of my own. Holmes sealed the envelope and addressed it to Inspector Lestrade before explaining the outline of his plan. The note instructed Lestrade to spread a very particular piece of information through the appropriate channels within Scotland Yard. According to the message, Holmes had discovered evidence proving that Charles Davenport possessed documents capable of identifying the true mastermind behind the fraudulent shipping accounts. Furthermore, Holmes intended to meet Davenport privately that very evening to examine the material. You are announcing this publicly? I asked with surprise. Holmes nodded calmly. Our adversary has demonstrated an admirable habit of anticipating developments in the investigation. If he truly fears exposure, then the knowledge that Davenport possesses such documents will force him to act, to silence Davenport permanently. I said, exactly. The boldness of Holmes' strategy left me momentarily speechless. But if the murderer learns that Davenport plans to reveal his identity tonight, he may attempt another attack. Holmes' smile returned. That is precisely what I am counting upon. The implications of his plans soon became clear. Holmes intended to arrange a meeting at Davenport's office that evening, while Lestrade and several officers from Scotland Yard concealed themselves nearby. If the true criminal attempted to eliminate Davenport once more, he would walk directly into Holmes' carefully prepared trap. Do you truly believe he will come? I asked. Holmes folded the letter and handed it to Mrs. Hudson for immediate delivery. My dear Watson, he replied calmly, a man who has gone to such extraordinary lengths to protect his secret will not hesitate. When faced with the prospect of exposure, Holmes then moved toward the small cabinet near the fireplace and began assembling several items he occasionally used during undercover investigations: a dark overcoat, a false mustache, and a pair of tinted spectacles. You intend to disguise yourself? I asked. Holmes nodded. Our opponent has demonstrated a remarkable awareness of my involvement in this case. It would therefore be prudent to observe the evening's events without announcing my presence. The quiet confidence with which he prepared for the confrontation stirred both admiration and unease within me. For the first time since the affair had begun, Holmes was no longer merely reacting to the crimes that had already occurred. He was actively challenging the mind that had constructed the Baker Street trap, and Yet, as I watched him calmly arranging the details of his strategy, I could not entirely dismiss a troubling thought that lingered at the edge of my mind. For if our adversary truly possessed the foresight Holmes suspected, then it was entirely possible that he had anticipated this move as well. Holmes seemed to sense my concern. "You are wondering whether our opponent might predict this plan," he said. I admitted that the possibility had crossed my mind. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, every game of strategy involves risk. The question is not whether our adversary will anticipate the trap, but whether he will believe himself clever enough to overcome it." He glanced toward the darkening window, where the London evening was beginning to settle over Baker Street. "And if my judgment of his character is correct," Holmes added quietly, "then pride alone will compel him to make his move." Thus, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any I had previously witnessed. For that evening, within the shadowed offices of the Davenport Shipping Company, Sherlock Holmes intended to meet the mysterious criminal who had dared to challenge him, and somewhere within the fog-covered streets of London, that criminal was already preparing to strike again. The hours leading to that evening passed with a peculiar tension that I can scarcely describe. For it was evident that we stood upon the threshold of a decisive moment in the strange contest between Sherlock Holmes and the unseen intelligence that had engineered the events surrounding Baker Street. Holmes himself displayed a calm that bordered on indifference, though I had known him long enough to recognize that such composure masked an extraordinary concentration of thought. He spent the afternoon refining the details of his plan and reviewing once more the chain of evidence which had gradually emerged from the investigation of Edward Mallory's death. By early evening, the London fog had thickened into a dense mist that clung to the streets and blurred the glow of the gas lamps along the river. Holmes and I departed Baker Street shortly after sunset, traveling by carriage toward the offices of the Davenport Shipping Company, where the next act of the drama would unfold. Holmes had already adopted the disguise he had prepared earlier: a dark coat, tinted spectacles, and a carefully arranged mustache that altered the shape of his face just enough to conceal his identity from a casual observer. The transformation was so convincing that even I found it difficult at first glance to recognize my friend. When we arrived near the shipping office, we found that Inspector Lestrade and several officers from Scotland Yard had already taken their positions within the surrounding buildings. Holmes' message had been delivered earlier that afternoon, and the inspector had followed the instructions with unusual diligence. The plan, as Holmes had explained, was simple in design, yet delicate in execution. Charles Davenport would remain inside his office as though preparing to meet Holmes privately, while Lestrade's men concealed themselves in nearby rooms and alleyways to intercept anyone attempting to enter the building. Davenport himself had recovered sufficiently from the earlier attack to cooperate with the arrangement, though the man's nervous demeanor made it clear that he feared another attempt upon his life. Holmes spoke briefly with him before taking up a position in the shadows of an adjoining office, where we could observe the corridor leading to Davenport's room without revealing our presence. The building soon fell into an uneasy silence. Outside, the muffled sounds of carriage wheels and distant footsteps echoed faintly through the fog-filled streets. But within the offices, nothing stirred. The gas lamps along the hallway flickered softly, casting long, shifting shadows across the wooden floor. Holmes remained motionless beside the doorway, his sharp eyes fixed upon the far end of the corridor, where the main entrance lay. Nearly an hour passed in this tense stillness. At last, just as I had begun to wonder whether our mysterious adversary might have sensed the trap, Holmes raised a finger, slightly a silent signal that he had heard something. From below came the faint creak of a door opening. A moment later, the sound of footsteps echoed within the stairwell. The footsteps were cautious and deliberate, as though the intruder had entered the building with great care to avoid detection. Holmes leaned slightly forward, his entire posture alert with anticipation. The figure soon appeared at the top of the staircase, emerging from the darkness of the lower floor into the dim light of the hallway. The man was dressed in a dark coat and hat that concealed much of his face. Yet there was something about the quiet confidence of his movements that immediately struck me as unusual. He paused briefly to glance along the corridor before proceeding toward Davenport's office with steady determination. Holmes remained perfectly still as the figure approached. I could feel my pulse quicken with the realization that the moment of confrontation had finally arrived. The stranger reached Davenport's door and listened carefully before removing a small instrument from his pocket. With surprising skill, he manipulated the lock until the door opened silently inward. The man slipped inside without hesitation, turned to me and whispered softly, "Now?" Within seconds, we moved down the corridor while Inspector Lestrade and two officers emerged from their hiding places behind us. The door to Davenport's office remained slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening we could see the dimly lit room beyond. The intruder stood beside Davenport's desk. In his hand gleamed the faint reflection of a blade. Davenport himself had risen from his chair in obvious alarm, his voice trembling as he attempted to speak. What do you want?" He stammered. The intruder stepped closer. "I want the documents," the man replied in a low voice. The words carried a quiet authority that suggested both intelligence and confidence. Davenport hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door as though hoping for rescue. "You're too late," he said. "I've already given them to Holmes." For the briefest moment, the intruder stood perfectly still. Then he laughed softly. "Holmes," he said, "has been part of this game from the very beginning." At that instant, Holmes pushed the door fully open and stepped into the room. "I quite agree," he said calmly. The intruder turned sharply, clearly startled by the sudden appearance of the man he had expected to meet later that evening. Behind Holmes, Lestrade and the officers moved forward to block the exit. The stranger's eyes moved quickly from one face to another as he realized that the building had been surrounded for the first time since entering the room. He appeared genuinely surprised. Holmes removed his tinted spectacles and false mustache. "You have displayed admirable ingenuity in arranging these events," Holmes continued quietly. "But I fear the game has now reached its conclusion." The man's expression changed slowly from surprise to something closer to amusement. "Has it?" he replied. Holmes studied him closely. "Yes," he said, "because the trap you constructed has finally revealed its true purpose." The stranger smiled faintly, as though he had been waiting for precisely this moment. "My dear Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "you may discover that the trap has not yet fully closed." And as those words echoed through the dimly lit office, I felt a sudden and unsettling realization, for the man standing before us did not appear frightened or desperate. On the contrary, he seemed entirely composed, as though the events unfolding in that room had proceeded exactly as he had intended. The calm composure of the man standing before us created a moment of silence within the dim office that seemed almost unnatural. Inspector Lestrade and the officers from Scotland Yard had already positioned themselves between the stranger and the doorway, leaving no visible means of escape. Yet the intruder showed no sign of panic. Instead, he regarded Sherlock Holmes with a curious mixture of admiration and amusement, as though the entire situation had unfolded precisely as he had anticipated. Holmes observed him with equal intensity, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. In that brief exchange of silent glances, I sensed that two powerful intellects were measuring one another with remarkable precision. The stranger's posture remained relaxed, the knife still resting loosely in his hand, though he made no attempt to threaten anyone in the room. Instead, he allowed the weapon to fall gently upon Davenport's desk before speaking in a calm and measured tone. "I must congratulate you, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Few men would have recognized the structure of the game as quickly as you have." Lestrade stepped forward impatiently. "That will do," the inspector said sharply. "You can offer your compliments at the station. For now, you are under arrest for the murder of Edward Mallory and the attempted murder of Charles Davenport." The man inclined his head politely but made no effort to resist. Holmes, however, raised a hand gently. "One moment." "Inspector," he said, "before we proceed any further, I believe our guest deserves the opportunity to understand precisely how his scheme has been unraveled." The stranger's eyes brightened slightly. "Ah," he said with a faint smile. "Then you have solved it completely." Holmes stepped forward into the light of the gas lamp, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the office floor. "I believe I have," he replied quietly. He turned briefly toward me, and I recognized the familiar expression that had so often preceded one of Holmes' remarkable explanations. "My dear Watson," he began, "you will recall that from the very beginning this case presented an unusual characteristic. The murder of Edward Mallory was not merely a crime, it was a message. The victim arrived at Baker Street carrying a warning addressed to me, and yet he was killed before he could deliver it. Such an arrangement suggested that the murderer intended not only to silence Mallory, but also to ensure that his death would attract my immediate attention." The stranger nodded slowly, clearly following the reasoning with interest. Holmes continued. "The second development, the attack upon Charles Davenport, served an equally important purpose. It created the illusion that Davenport himself might be the target of some unknown enemy, while simultaneously removing the financial documents that Mallory had been investigating. In other words, the criminal wished to eliminate two men who possessed knowledge of his activities while directing suspicion away from himself." Lestrade folded his arms impatiently. "That part seems clear enough," he said. "But who exactly is he?" Holmes' gaze returned to the calm figure before. "Wes, the answer lies within the shipping accounts themselves." Stranger smiled faintly. "Go on," he said. Holmes continued speaking with quiet certainty. "Edward Mallory discovered irregular financial transfers within the Davenport Shipping Company, transfers that appeared to involve several shipments arriving through the London docks under false documentation. The profits from these operations were carefully concealed within the company's accounting system, making it appear that the discrepancies were nothing more than clerical errors." Davenport, who had been listening with growing astonishment, suddenly stepped forward. "You mean someone inside the company has been using our ships for smuggling?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And Mallory's investigation came dangerously close to exposing the individual responsible." Lestrade frowned. "But if it wasn't Davenport?" "Then who?" Holmes gestured calmly toward the man standing beside the desk. "The company's external financial advisor." The stranger bowed slightly. "A most impressive deduction." Mr. Holmes. Lestrade stared at him in disbelief. "You?" The man removed his hat and placed it upon the desk. "My name," he said calmly, "is Victor Langford." Holmes nodded. Langford enjoyed complete access to the company's financial records while remaining sufficiently distant from daily operations to avoid suspicion. When Mallory began examining the accounts, Langford realized that exposure was only a matter of time. He therefore arranged Mallory's death before the investigation could reach its conclusion. Langford listened attentively, showing no sign of agitation. Holmes continued. "The murder at Baker Street served two purposes. First, it eliminated Mallory. Second, It ensured that I would become personally involved in the case. You see, Mr. Langford possesses a rather unusual form of vanity. He wished not merely to escape justice, but to test his intellect against my own. Langford smiled openly now. I admit the temptation was irresistible. Lestrade looked bewildered. You're saying he killed a man just to challenge Holmes? Holmes shook his head slightly. No, Inspector. The murder was necessary to protect his criminal enterprise. The challenge was merely an indulgence. Langford clasped his hands calmly behind his back. I must confess, Mr. Holmes, that I underestimated the speed with which you would perceive the pattern. I believed the forged letter and the suspicion directed toward Davenport might delay you for several days. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. The forged letter was indeed ingenious. But the wording of Mallory's final note revealed that he had already attempted to warn me. Once I discovered that inconsistency, the rest of the structure began to collapse. Langford sighed softly. A pity. I had hoped for a longer contest. Lestrade stepped forward once more, now thoroughly convinced. Well, Mr. Langford, I'm afraid the contest is over. Two officers moved forward and placed the man under arrest. Yet as they escorted him toward the door, Langford paused and turned back toward Holmes with an expression that contained not resentment, but genuine admiration. I must thank you for the experience, Mr. Holmes, he said quietly. Few men could have unraveled the trap so elegantly. Holmes inclined his head politely. You flatter me. Langford smiled one final time. And yet, he added softly, for a brief moment, I believe we were evenly matched. With that, he allowed the officers from Scotland Yard to lead him away. When the door closed behind them, the tension that had filled the office seemed to dissolve at last. Davenport sank heavily into his chair, clearly overwhelmed by the realization of how close he had come to death. Holmes, however, remained silent for several moments, gazing thoughtfully at the desk where Langford had stood. My dear Watson, he said, quietly at last, I must admit that Mr. Langford possessed a mind of remarkable subtlety. You mean he truly was your equal? I asked. Holmes considered the question carefully before replying, not quite. He picked up the abandoned knife from the desk and examined it briefly before placing it aside, but he came closer than most, and with that simple remark, the long and dangerous contest between Sherlock Holmes and the architect of the Baker Street trap finally reached its end. The arrest of Victor Langford marked the formal conclusion of the extraordinary affair that had begun so mysteriously within the hallway of Baker Street. In the days that followed, the officers of Scotland Yard uncovered overwhelming evidence of the elaborate smuggling network Langford had constructed beneath the guise of legitimate shipping accounts. Hidden transactions, falsified cargo records, and a chain of accomplices operating quietly along the London docks revealed a criminal enterprise of considerable scale. Yet it was the testimony surrounding the death of Edward Mallory and the attempted murder of Charles Davenport that ultimately sealed Langford's fate. For the careful web of deception he had woven could not withstand the scrutiny of Holmes' relentless logic. When at last the excitement of the investigation had subsided, Holmes and I found ourselves once more within the familiar comfort of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fog of that memorable week had lifted somewhat, allowing pale winter sunlight to filter through the windows and illuminate the quiet interior of the room. Holmes sat in his customary armchair beside the fireplace, his long frame relaxed and his violin resting idly across his knee. For several minutes he drew the bow slowly across the strings, producing a soft and reflective melody that seemed well suited to the contemplative mood that followed the resolution of a difficult case. As for myself, I had taken up my notebook and begun the task of recording the final details of the affair, though I found my thoughts wandering repeatedly to the unusual character of Victor Langford. It was not often that a criminal managed to hold Holmes' genuine respect. And yet, throughout the investigation, Holmes had spoken of the man with a certain reluctant admiration. At length, I set aside my pen and turned toward my friend. "You appear unusually thoughtful today, Holmes," I remarked. Holmes lowered the violin and smiled faintly. "Do I, Watson?" "Indeed. I cannot help wondering whether you are reflecting upon Mr. Langford." Holmes leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands together. "It would be difficult not to reflect upon him," he admitted quietly. Langford possessed a mind of exceptional clarity. His plan demonstrated patience, foresight, and an understanding of strategy that one rarely encounters among ordinary criminals. "You mean the trap he arranged at Baker Street?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. By orchestrating the murder of Mallory at my own doorstep, he ensured my personal involvement in the case. At the same time, he constructed a convincing narrative that directed suspicion toward Davenport while he quietly removed the evidence that threatened his enterprise. It was an arrangement of remarkable ingenuity. I considered this for a moment before speaking again. And yet you defeated him." Holmes gave a soft laugh. "My dear Watson, victory in such matters is rarely a question of brilliance alone. It is often determined by the smallest inconsistency, the single thread, which, once pulled, causes the entire fabric to unravel." "You mean the wording of Mallory's warning?" I said. "Exactly. Langford forged the letter requesting a meeting, but he failed to anticipate that Mallory might attempt to deliver a final message in his dying moments. That one sentence, 'I warned you about the trap,' revealed that a previous communication must have existed. Once that inconsistency appeared, the entire structure of Langford's deception began to collapse." I nodded slowly, appreciating once again the remarkable precision of Holmes' reasoning. "But I confess," I added thoughtfully, "that Langford himself did not appear particularly distressed by the outcome." Holmes' expression grew reflective. "No," he agreed, "and that is what makes the case so unusual." He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, gazing down at the busy London street below. "You see, Watson, Langford did not merely seek profit from his crimes. He also desired the satisfaction of intellectual competition. In his mind, the entire affair was a form of strategic game, one in which he believed himself capable of matching wits with the only detective in London whose abilities he truly respected. And for a time," I said, "it seemed he might succeed." Holmes smiled. "Slightly, yes. For a time." He turned back toward me with that familiar glimmer of quiet amusement in his eyes, "but the difficulty with elaborate traps is that they require perfect control over every element of the design. The moment a single detail escapes the architect's control, the entire mechanism becomes vulnerable." I glanced once more at my notebook where the story of the Baker Street murder had now reached its final pages. It was certainly the most unusual case I have witnessed, I admitted. Holmes resumed his seat beside the fire and lifted the violin once again. "Unusual, yes," he said softly, "but also instructive. In what way?" I asked. Holmes drew the bow gently across the strings before answering. "It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous adversaries are not always those who rely upon brute force or reckless violence. Far more formidable are the minds that operate patiently from the shadows, constructing intricate designs that appear flawless at first glance." "And yet," I said, smiling slightly, "those designs must still contend with Sherlock Holmes." Holmes laughed quietly. "My dear Watson, you exaggerate my abilities. I merely observe what others overlook." T began playing once more, allowing the gentle notes of the violin to fill the room with a calm and reflective melody. Outside the window, London moved forward with its usual restless energy, carriages rattling over the cobblestones, pedestrians hurrying along the pavement, and the distant rumble of the city echoing through the winter air. Somewhere within that vast and complex metropolis, another mystery was undoubtedly already taking shape, waiting to challenge the keen intellect of my remarkable companion. As I closed my notebook and placed it upon the table, I could not help but feel once again the familiar sense of admiration that had accompanied so many of Holmes' triumphs. For although Victor Langford had come closer than most to matching his brilliance, the final outcome of the contest had proven what I had long believed to be true. In the delicate and dangerous game of logic, deception, and deduction, the mind of Sherlock Holmes remained without equal, and thus concluded this strange and memorable affair which I have chosen to record under the title, The Case of the 221B Trap. The one time Sherlock Holmes met his match.